Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that's, well, probably crossed every student's mind at some point. Does it really make a difference if you take a test on a computer or, with good old pen and paper?
Mm,
We're specifically zooming in on secondary school students, the year 9, so around 13 or 14 years old.
hmm
And our focus is a science revision quiz. Ohm's Law, specifically.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you flagged the study, a testing load. It's quite a title. And investigating test mode effects, and so on. It's fascinating because it looks beyond just the final score, right?
Oh,
We're
yeah.
going to explore how the test format influences not only how well students do, but also like how they think about the questions and the actual effort they feel they're putting in.
Yeah, because as the learner, you're looking for those real insights quickly and, thoroughly. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. Figure out if this seemingly simple choice, computer versus paper, has some maybe surprising implications for how students learn and, importantly, how we assess what they know.
Definitely. We'll be pulling out the key nuggets from this research to give everyone a clear picture.
So what's interesting, I guess, from the start is that you might assume the format wouldn't matter that much.
Right. Some earlier studies even suggested that whether a test was on screen or paper didn't really change the scores or, how much brain power students used.
So,
But then you've got other research hinting that younger students, especially, might find computer-based tests, well, a different ballgame altogether.
hmm.
So this study we're diving into today really aimed to understand why we're seeing these sort of contradictory findings.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this study then. How did the researchers actually investigate this question?
They used a really solid approach. It's called a repeated measures design.
Okay.
This involved 263 Year 9 science students over in Western Australia, and every single student took two versions of the same Ohm's Law revision quiz.
Verse.
Yeah, one was the traditional paper-based test, the PBT, and the other was the computer-based test, CBT. And critically, the content, the actual questions, were designed to be identical.
So it wasn't like some students got an easier ride with one format or the other.
Not at all, no. And to make it even more insightful, within each quiz, they deliberately played with how difficult the questions were. They included some easier questions and some more challenging ones. They
Mhm.
defined this difficulty based on something they called element interactivity. You can sort of think of it as how many different bits of information you need to juggle in your head at the same time to solve it.
Right. Makes sense.
And they had expert science teachers help validate these difficulty levels, make sure they were accurate.
Okay, so a mix of straightforward and tricky questions on both paper and screen.
Mhm.
What exactly were they measuring then? Was it just the scores?
Oh, far from it. They looked at several key things. Obviously, test performance, the scores, that's number one.
Sure.
But they also measured something called subjective cognitive load.
Subjective cognitive load. What does that mean in practice?
It's basically about how difficult the students felt the questions were and also how much mental effort they perceived they were putting in, how hard they thought they were trying.
Okay. How do they measure that?
They used a simple 9-point scale right after each question to capture that feeling in the moment.
Interesting. So trying to get a sense of the actual mental experience for the students.
Precisely. And they also kept track of how much scratch paper the students used.
Oh, right. The working out.
Yeah, the number of working steps they jotted down, basically, for both the paper and the computer tests. They looked at that.
Good.
And finally, they also assessed each student's working memory capacity, or WMC.
WMC.
Yeah, using a test called the reverse fidget span test. It gives an idea of how much information someone can kind of hold and manipulate in their mind at once.
Got it. And this all happened in schools.
Yeah, what's great is that it all took place in their normal classrooms with their own science teachers. That makes the findings feel really relevant to, real world education.
Definitely. Okay, a really comprehensive picture they were trying to build. So the big question, what did they actually discover when they looked at how the students performed on these tests?
Well, the results were quite interesting, actually, and maybe a little unexpected in parts. Overall, students scored better on the difficult questions when they took the paper-based tests.
Okay, so paper wins for the hard stuff.
That's the immediate takeaway, yeah. When the material gets challenging, good old paper seems to give students a bit of an edge.
Okay, so when things got tough, paper had the advantage. What about the questions that were designed to be easier?
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. For the easy questions, students actually performed better on the computer-based test.
Wow. Okay, that's not what I would have guessed. Why? What's the thinking behind that?
So the researchers suggest it might come down to this idea of cognitive load again. For the easy questions on a computer, maybe the format is just a bit more engaging, or perhaps it demands slightly more focused attention, but without being overwhelming.
Okay.
And this could potentially boost what's called germane processing. That's the good kind of mental effort, the one that's directly helping you learn and understand the actual content.
So the computer might just keep you a little more, like, on task for the simpler stuff.
Something like that, potentially. But then when you flip it and look at the harder questions,
Yeah.
they believe the computer-based test might introduce more extraneous load,
Extraneous meaning.
meaning mental effort that doesn't actually help you understand the material itself,
Yeah.
but is just related to, say, navigating the interface, clicking buttons, scrolling, that kind of thing.
Oh, okay. The admin of taking the test on a computer.
Exactly. And this extra mental load could really get in the way when the intrinsic load, the inherent difficulty of the question itself is already high. So for you, the learner, this suggests the format itself isn't neutral. It can either help or hinder depending on how complex the material is.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If you're already wrestling with a tricky problem, having to also figure out the computer interface might just add to the mental clutter, Ada.
Precisely.
Did they put numbers on these differences? How big were they?
They did. For the easy questions, students scored roughly 7% better on the computer-based test.
All right, 7%.
But for the difficult questions, they scored a pretty significant 11.5% better on the paper-based test.
Wow, 11.5%. That's quite a difference.
It really is. Those are definitely noticeable differences, especially when we're talking about understanding more challenging scientific concepts like Ohm's law.
Yeah, those are pretty substantial percentages. So it's
Exactly.
clear the test format isn't neutral in its impact on scores. Now, what about how difficult the students felt the tests were? That subjective cognitive load you mentioned.
This is another interesting twist. Across both the easy and the difficult questions, students reported that the paper-based tests felt more difficult.
More difficult on paper.
Yeah, and they also reported putting more mental effort into the paper tests.
Huh. That's almost the opposite of what the score results showed for the difficult questions, isn't it? Paper felt harder, but they did better on the hard questions on paper. Why the disconnect?
It's a bit puzzling. There are a few possibilities the researchers floated. One is simply familiarity.
Mm.
You know, even though these are digital natives, they likely still have more years of experience, maybe feel more comfortable with traditional paper tests in an assessment context.
Okay, so maybe it just feels more like serious work on paper.
Potentially. So the act itself might feel inherently more demanding. Another idea is about what those subjective scales were actually measuring.
Hmm.
Maybe the scales for perceived difficulty and effort primarily capture the intrinsic load, how hard the questions themselves were, rather than picking up on the more subtle differences in extraneous load, the format-related load from the computer.
Ah, so when they said paper felt harder, it might have been more about the difficulty of the Ohm's law problems themselves, not necessarily the paper format causing extra difficulty.
That's a plausible interpretation, yeah. Their feeling of difficulty might not have accurately reflected those extra background mental steps involved in using the computer.
Okay.
And the researchers also tossed out the idea that putting in more reported effort on paper might actually reflect more effective test-taking strategies, like showing you're working clearly, which is easier on paper.
Right.
Or maybe paper-based tests simply have a greater sense of face validity for students. They might just feel like a more real or serious test.
That's a really insightful point. Okay, what about the scratch paper? You mentioned they track that.
Yeah.
When I'm tackling any kind of science or math problem, I always feel like I need space to scribble things down.
You're definitely not alone there. And the study found, perhaps unsurprisingly, significantly greater use of scratch paper during the paper-based tests.
Okay.
And this was true for both the easy and the difficult questions.
Makes sense. You've got the paper right there, ready to go. No switching needed.
Exactly. But here's a really crucial detail, I think. During the computer-based tests, the use of scratch paper actually decreased as the question difficulty increased.
Wait, say that again? Less scratch paper use on the harder computer questions.
Correct.
That seems totally counterintuitive. If the questions are getting harder, you'd think they'd need more scratch paper to help them think it through.
That's what makes it such a key finding. The researchers suspect there's a kind of cognitive cost involved in switching your attention between the computer screen and a separate piece of scratch paper.
The screen-to-paper jump.
Right. On a difficult question, when students are already using a lot of their working memory just to understand the problem, the extra step of looking away from the screen, finding their place on the paper, writing something down, then looking back and refocusing on the screen, it might just be too much of a mental hurdle.
So it adds to that extraneous load we talked about.
That's the hypothesis. It adds friction. So for you, the learner, this suggests the digital format might unintentionally discourage a really helpful problem-solving strategy, especially when things get tough.
Wow. So the format itself might be hindering them from using a tool scratch paper that could actually help them perform better on those harder questions.
Precisely. And they also highlight the connection between using scratch paper and those underlying working memory processes. If your working memory is already really being taxed by a difficult question, you might be less likely to expend the extra cognitive energy needed to switch to scratch paper, even if it would ultimately be beneficial.
Okay, so we've seen how the test format seems to affect performance, scratch paper use, and how students perceive the effort.
Yeah.
What role did their actual working memory capacity, the WMC you mentioned, play in all of this?
This is a really important piece of the puzzle. When the researchers statistically controlled for the students' working memory capacity,
Yeah.
the overall effect of the testing mode computer versus paper on their total test scores became non-significant.
Wait, hold on. So once they factored in how good their working memory was, the overall difference in scores between computer and paper tests kind of vanished.
That's right, overall, which strongly suggests that working memory capacity might be a key factor modulating how students interact with different testing formats. It helps explain some of that difference.
Okay.
However, and this is a really important however, working memory capacity did not get rid of the interaction effect.
The interaction effect, you mean
The pattern we saw earlier. Better performance on easy questions on the computer, but better performance on difficult questions on paper. That specific pattern still held up even when they controlled for working memory.
Okay, so WMC explains some of the general difference between the formats, but not why the pattern flips depending on whether the question is easy or hard.
Exactly. It doesn't explain that switchover point. Also, it's worth noting, WMC didn't significantly affect the students' reported cognitive load either.
So even students with stronger working memory still felt that the paper tests were more difficult or required more effort.
Apparently so, yes, based on their self-reports.
Interesting. What are the implications of all this then, especially thinking about students who might have a lower working memory capacity?
Well, it strongly suggests that those students might be disproportionately affected, maybe disadvantaged, by computer-based testing, particularly when they're grappling with challenging material.
How so?
If the computer format inherently adds extra cognitive demands, that extraneous load, the screen switching cost, and they already have less working memory bandwidth available, well, it could really put them at a disadvantage in showing what they actually know and understand.
Yeah.
So for you, the learner, this raises a really important point about fairness and equity in assessment, doesn't it?
It really does. That's a serious concern. Are we testing their science knowledge or their ability to manage cognitive load on a specific platform?
Exactly. Now, the researchers did point out some limitations, which is good practice.
Sure.
Working memory capacity was measured using just one specific test, that reverse digit span. There are other ways to assess it, so, that's one factor.
Okay.
And also, they didn't directly measure how much prior knowledge the students had specifically about Ohm's law. That could also play a role, right? Someone with really solid expertise might not be as impacted by the format differences.
Right. That makes perfect sense. If you really know this stuff inside out, maybe the format matters less.
Could be.
So bringing it all together, what are the really big takeaways from this study? What does it tell us about using computers for testing in general, especially for students this age, sort of early secondary?
I think the main thing is that it really forces us to question the assumption that online assessments are just, equivalent substitutes for paper-based ones.
They're not necessarily interchangeable.
Not necessarily, no. Not for all students, and crucially not for all types of questions, particularly in secondary school. We can't just assume they yield the same results or represent the same cognitive processes.
And this has real-world consequences, right? I mean, there's such a huge push towards more and more online testing, standardized assessments moving online.
Exactly. The researchers specifically raised concerns about this uncritical rush towards widespread online testing. They even mentioned tasks like writing.
Oh yeah, writing on a computer versus paper.
Right, where the increased time and maybe the mechanical effort of typing versus handwriting could further tax working memory, potentially changing the nature of the task itself.
Hmm.
So they emphasize that educators, policymakers, assessment designers, they need to really carefully consider this testing load imposed by the format itself. It's not just about the content being assessed.
We need to make sure we're measuring what we intend to measure.
Precisely. We need to ensure we're getting a fair picture of what students understand, not just measuring their ability to navigate a particular test format under, potentially high pressure conditions.
And the fact that this study was done in actual classrooms, you mentioned, with the regular teachers,
Mm.
that really adds weight, doesn't it? It's not some artificial lab setup.
Absolutely. That authentic classroom setting makes the results feel much more relevant and applicable to real world educational practice.
Okay, so to really boil it down for the learner, what are the absolute key things we should remember from this deep dive?
Well, I think number one is the evidence suggests that while computer-based tests might have some advantages for simpler recall tasks, those easy questions with low element interactivity,
Right.
it looked like paper-based tests seem to better support deeper thinking and performance when students are tackling more challenging material, at least for this age group, year 9.
Okay, so computer maybe okay for easy recall,
Yeah.
paper better for complex problems.
That's a good summary, yeah.
Yeah.
And the second key thing is that the format isn't just a neutral delivery method. It significantly affects not only their scores, but also how they approach problem solving, like using scratch paper and the mental effort they perceive they have to put in.
And thirdly, we absolutely can't overlook that potential disadvantage for students with lower working memory capacity in computer-based testing scenarios, especially when the material gets difficult.
That's a crucial point, yeah.
Yeah.
That testing load of the format itself can interact with individual students' cognitive resources in ways we really need to be aware of for fairness.
This has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's more complex than just paper or screen.
Uh,
So, considering all of this, here's a final thought for you, the learner, to chew on. Given these findings, how should educators and policymakers really carefully consider that balance? The balance between, the efficiency and the tech appeal of computer-based testing on one hand, and the potential cognitive impacts on students on the other, particularly when the goal is to assess complex knowledge.
Hmm.
What are the implications for how we design not just our assessments, but maybe even our learning experiences in this increasingly digital world? It really makes you reflect on your own experiences with different test formats too, doesn't it? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.